The Force is old and full of shadows.
The council chamber breathed. That was the only word for it. The slow, almost organic rhythm of the city pushing light through those tall angled windows. The amber glow of a million skylanes strobing in lazy pulses across the stone floor. No session was in progress. No masters occupied the ring of chairs. The chamber existed in these hours before dawn, as a place of pure waiting, as though the room itself understood that something was coming, and had chosen to hold its breath until it arrived. Anakin Skywalker sat in Mace Windu's chair. He had not chosen it deliberately. He had crossed the chamber in a daze after the council dismissed him, after they sent him back to meditate, as though meditation was a thing a man could manage with. Padmé's face burning behind his eyelids, and Palpatine's voice still coiling in his ear like smoke. And he had simply sat down in the nearest chair, and the nearest chair happened to be this one, the seat of the man who had doubted him longest, the seat of the man who would, in the hours remaining to this night, either arrest the Supreme Chancellor of the Republic or die trying. He looked at the chair he was sitting in, ran his left hand along the armrest, the way a man touched a thing he was trying to understand through his fingers. He had been in this room hundreds of times, for hearings, for assessments, for the long unresolved argument of his membership in this order, and he had never once sat in the ring, always at the center, always the one being evaluated, circled, the 12 chairs arranged in their perfect loop, the way a jury arranged itself around a question it hadn't answered yet. He thought about what it had cost him all those years to care about that arrangement. He thought about the boy he had been at 9 years old, standing in the center of this room for the first time, with no one except a dead man's promise and a fear he hadn't known he was allowed to have. He thought about the years of reaching for approval that kept moving, the way approval always moved when approval was the point. He thought about what Palpatine had known about that boy that the Council hadn't, or hadn't tried to, and what that knowledge had been worth, compounded across 15 years. He stopped thinking about it. The math was not useful to him right now. He looked toward the window that faced the Senate district. Her apartment was that direction. He could not see it from here. 20 levels of cityscape and a dozen arcologies stood between them. But he looked anyway, the way a man looks at a locked door he has no key for. She's alive. He pressed the thought down like a thumb against a wound. She's alive right now. The babies are alive. Nothing has happened yet. Yet the word sat in his chest like a sliver of transparasteel. He pressed his thumb against it and felt the edge of it and did not flinch. He had flinched from it once, in another version of this night, had felt the word yet and run directly toward the thing that had made it true. He understood that now. He understood it the way you understood a mechanism once it had already worked on you, once you had been through it and come out the other side knowing exactly how the parts moved. He did not know how long he had been sitting there when it happened. Later, if anyone had asked him to describe it, he would have reached for the language of combat, the sudden, absolute stillness that precedes the moment a lightsaber ignites, when the body already knows what the mind is still deciding. It was not a vision. It was not a dream. The council chamber did not dissolve. He remained precisely where he was, in Mace Windu's chair, with the city painting slow gold across the floor. But something opened. Blaster fire, the smell of burning plastoid and ozone, and something else beneath it, something sweetly chemical that a man learned to identify and never forgot. The smell of human flesh cauterized by energy discharge, repeated over and over until it became the ambient texture of a battlefield. Screams that cut off too quickly. A sound like mechanical breathing, vast and slow and rhythmic, the most recognizable sound in a generation of nightmares. And it was his breathing, coming from inside a chest that was not his chest, armor that was not armor but a life support tomb. And the force around him was not the warm breathing network he had always known, but a cold and narrow corridor, a weapons barrel, everything compressed into hatred, because hatred was the only fuel the machine had left. A flash of white and black, the geometry of a corridor aboard a ship he had built from scratch, and loved the way a man loved a thing he had made with his hands. Bodies in white armor, fallen in the positions that armor fell in when the life left it suddenly, and the weight distribution was wrong. The particular smell of a ship that had been a home and had become something else in the span of a single order. A voice. Young. Desperate. Father. The sound cracked the vision like a stone through glass. Anakin came back into his body so hard he nearly fell out of the chair. His hands slammed down against the armrests. Real hands. 22 years old. The left one flesh, the right one durasteel, neither of them gloved in black, neither of them large enough. They were never large enough, he understood now, with the clarity of a man who had worn the other version of them for 23 years, to fill the gauntlets waiting for him if he made the wrong choice. He breathed. The lungs were the worst part of it. They worked, clean and full and silent, drawing air without resistance, without the bellows wheeze that had been the only sound he heard for decades inside that helmet. The sound he had gone to sleep to and woken up to, until the sound of his own breathing became indistinguishable from the sound of his own punishment. He breathed now and felt the absence of that weight like a man who sets down something he's been carrying so long he forgot it was separate from his spine. His hands were shaking. He looked at them. Right hand first. The prosthetic. The one that had been with him since Geonosis. The one he had learned to ignore the way a man learned to ignore a scar. Then the left. Flesh and bone and 22 years of callus from a lightsaber hilt. The same hand that would, if he did nothing, become something none of his Jedi training had words for. He closed both of them into fists, held them, felt the pressure in his palms, real and immediate, the sensation that confirmed he was here and not there, that the corridor with its fallen white armor was a future rather than a present. It could stay a future. That was the whole point of still having hands. What do you know? He forced himself to inventory it. Not the emotion. The emotion could wait. The emotion would have to wait. The emotion was a luxury he could not afford for the next several hours, and he knew it the way only a man who had already lost everything once could know it. The facts. The facts were what mattered. He knew Order 66. He knew the chips. Every clone in the Grand Army of the Republic carried one, a piece of Kaminoan engineering so subtle that the Jedi had never detected it, would never detect it. Were about to discover it in the worst possible way imaginable. He knew the authorization structure of the inhibitor chip system, keyed to a single identity, triggered by a single broadcast, designed so that the order could be given once and carried everywhere simultaneously, without lag, without interpretation, without the variable of individual choice entering the calculation. He knew that whoever had designed the system had understood something important about genocide, that the only version that worked at scale was the version that required no one to decide. He knew that Palpatine had sat in his office 13 years ago and approved the design. He knew that in the hours remaining before dawn, Palpatine would sit in that same office and wait for Mace Windu to come through the door and give him the pretext he needed, had always needed, had engineered across a decade of war to manufacture. He knew that he had been the mechanism, the hand on the lever. He had stood at that window and watched four masters fall and called it justice. He did not let himself feel it. He noted it the way a surgeon noted a wound and moved on. What did he have? He had time. Not much. The margin was somewhere between razor-thin and non-existent, but some. Palpatine had not yet summoned him. Windu had not yet moved. The 501st was on Mandalore, and Ahsoka was on Mandalore, and Rex was on Mandalore. Rex, who in every version of this night still had a chip in his skull until someone cut it out. Rex, whose name was the first word Anakin had decided to put on a comm, the moment he reached a terminal. He had the temple's infrastructure. He had the technical knowledge of what the override channel looked like, where it sat in the frequency stack, what it would take to drown it in competing static. He had done the calculation on the stairwell down from the council chamber, worked it out step by step the way he worked out attack vectors. What needed to happen first? What needed to happen second? What was downstream of what? Where the bottlenecks were. He had, most importantly, the thing Palpatine did not know he had, the memory of the version of this night where all of it went wrong. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the one variable that changed everything. He stood up. The movement was so sudden, so certain, that the force shifted around him like water around a swimmer who has just decided which direction to swim. He felt it, the alignment of it, the way his body and his intention locked into the same axis. He had not felt the force this cleanly in 23 years. He had not felt it this cleanly, maybe, ever. Not without the static of rage underneath it, not without the constant low frequency of his own suffering distorting the signal. This was what it felt like to be whole. He did not have time to appreciate it. He filed it away, noted it, moved on. The council chamber was equipped with a secure terminal, a secondary interface for the comms spire that ran up the temple's central tower. The same relay that coordinated Clone Wars operations across 40 sectors. The same infrastructure that Palpatine's Sith override would use in a matter of hours to send 5 words to every clone commander in the galaxy. He was a Jedi general. His clearance was still valid. It would be valid until the moment it wasn't, and that moment had not arrived yet. He crossed the chamber in 9 strides, pressed his palm against the interface panel, and waited the 2 seconds it took for the system to recognize his biometrics. The screen lit green. He exhaled once, slow, through his nose, the old combat breath that Rex had watched him use 100 times before engagements, the one that meant, "I know what this is, and I am ready for it," and began to type. He had, by his best estimate, 40 minutes, maybe less, enough time to reach the comms vault, enough time to put himself between Palpatine and the machinery of genocide, enough time to warn Ahsoka, warn Rex, warn every Jedi he could reach before the silence of an open frequency became the loudest sound in the galaxy. He thought of Padmé's window. He thought of his son's voice, cracked and desperate in a place that no longer existed. Then he stopped thinking about all of it, because there was no room left in the next 40 minutes for anything except the work. He moved. The temple's sublevels had a smell. Most people who spent time in the upper sanctums, the training halls, the archives, the council tower, never noticed it, because most people never had reason to go below the 3rd sublevel. But Anakin had, twice, during the early years of the war when Republic intelligence had temporarily co-opted the comms vault for encrypted dispatches that couldn't risk the Senate's own relay infrastructure. He remembered the smell now as his boots found the first descending stairwell, old stone, recycled air, and the dry electrical bite of hardware that had been running without interruption for so long it had stopped generating heat and started generating something else, a mechanical patience, the ambient hum of a system that did not know what sleep was. He had not thought about that smell in years. The mind held on to the strangest things. He filed it alongside everything else the body had memorized without being asked. The weight of a lightsaber, the exact tension of a throttle at full burn, the smell of a sublevel corridor in the middle of the night, and used it as a compass. The stairwell had no lighting below the 2nd sublevel. Emergency strips ran along the baseboards, casting everything in a dim, bruised orange, the kind of light that flattened faces and made shadows absolute. Anakin did not ignite his lightsaber. The light would announce him, and there were temple guards on rotation even at this hour. Not many, but enough. He needed 2 minutes inside the vault before anyone knew he was there. After that, it wouldn't matter. He moved through the orange dark by memory and by feel, one hand brushing the corridor wall, the force pulling gently at his awareness the way it did in close terrain, not warning him of danger, just orienting him, the way a compass needle swings north without being asked. 3rd sublevel, left at the hydraulic junction. 17 steps to the blast door, he counted them. There was something clarifying about counting steps. It was one of the things combat had given him that he had never managed to explain to anyone who had not been through it, the way extreme necessity collapsed everything superfluous and left only the immediate, the step, the count, the next thing. He had operated in this mode before, in firefights, in the last minutes before a planetary evacuation, when the math was already wrong and the only thing left was to keep moving until you couldn't. He was in that mode now. It was, surprisingly, a relief. There was no room in it for the grief that was waiting somewhere behind his sternum, patient and enormous, the grief of a man who had already lived the version of tonight where he failed. He would feel it later. Later was survivable in a way that now was not, and now was what he had. The vault door was old Coruscanti durasteel, the kind installed during the Republic's previous century when the temple had been expanded, thick enough to survive an orbital strike and sealed with a biometric lock that had been updated exactly twice in 80 years. Anakin pressed his palm flat against the reader panel. 2 seconds. 3. The lock considered him. He could feel the slight mechanical pause that meant the system was cross-referencing clearance tiers. And then the bolts retracted with a sound like a held breath releasing, and the door swung inward on its hydraulic arm, smooth and silent and enormous. He stepped through. The comms vault was a long room, low-ceilinged, lined on both sides with server architecture that rose from floor to ceiling in black monolithic columns. Status lights ran up each column in vertical sequences, green, green, amber, green, blinking in no particular rhythm, each one marking a channel, A relay, a thread of signal that ran out of this room and into the HoloNet infrastructure that webbed across the entire galaxy. 40 sectors, thousands of ships, 100,000 clones, each of them carrying in the base of their skull a piece of technology so small you could lose it in your palm. All of it traceable back to this room. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it, and what he felt was not awe exactly, but something adjacent, the sensation of standing inside the scale of a thing that the eye could not properly measure. This was the machine Palpatine had built. Not the Senate, not the military, not the war. This room, these columns of blinking lights, the relay architecture that would carry 5 words to 100,000 men who had no mechanism for refusal. From outside, it looked like infrastructure. From inside, in the pre-dawn dark, with the status lights blinking their patient in different sequences, it looked like what it was, a designed killing system whose designers had been careful enough to make it look like nothing at all. He sat down at the primary console and pulled up the channel architecture, the display populated in tiers. Standard HoloNet relay at the top, open and civilian. Below that, the military command frequencies, GAR priority 1 through 7, each with their encryption signature rendered as a colored waveform across the screen. He scanned down the stack, looking for the pattern he knew was there, the pattern he had never had reason to look for in his previous life, because in his previous life he had not known to look. There, buried below GAR priority 7, a frequency with no label, no unit designation, no origin point, just a waveform signature that sat slightly outside the standard military band, narrow enough to look like noise if you weren't specifically searching for it, broadcasting on a loop so quiet it registered as background static. It had the Sith override prefix encoded in its carrier wave, not in the content, which was currently empty, but in the architecture of the signal itself. The channel was already open, had been open, he suspected, for years, waiting. He looked at the timestamp on the channel's last configuration edit. 12 years ago. The number landed quietly. 12 years ago he had been 20 years old, and still had the bruising from geonosis, and could not yet make his prosthetic hand perform fine motor tasks reliably. And this channel had been sitting here, configured and waiting, patient as the machines that housed it. 12 years of wars and briefings and missions and council sessions. 12 years of him walking past this sub-level every day, with no reason to go into it, and the channel had been here, waiting for the one morning when its architecture would finally matter. He pulled the frequency identifier and opened the jamming interface. This was the part where his knowledge ran thin. He was a pilot and a combatant and a general, not a slicer. His technical instincts ran toward mechanics and propulsion, the language of ships and weapons, not signal architecture. But he had spent enough years coordinating with Republic intelligence to understand the basic principle. You did not need to understand a signal to interrupt it. You needed to understand its frequency, its carrier bandwidth, and the minimum output required to drown it in competing noise. He had all three. He pulled the Temple's emergency broadcast array, a system designed to blanket Coruscant's airspace with priority signals in the event of a citywide crisis, never used in his lifetime, and began configuring its output to mirror the Sith override channel's exact bandwidth. Not a message, not content. Just noise, focused and sustained, a wall of static specifically shaped to collapse that one narrow frequency into uselessness the moment anyone tried to push a signal through it. His fingers moved across the keypad. The screens rearranged themselves as he worked, channel maps and output graphs shifting in response, and he was aware in some distant part of his mind of how strange his own hands looked doing this. The same hands that had pulled a starfighter through the Separatist blockade at Christophsis, now typing at a keyboard in a basement, trying to save the galaxy one keystroke at a time. He almost laughed. The jamming array took 4 minutes to configure. He knew because he was counting, the way he counted in combat, not anxiously, just as information, the way a pilot monitors fuel. 4 minutes to configure, then the countermand. He opened GAR Priority 1. His general's clearance populated the authentication fields automatically. The system recognized him without ceremony. He was, on paper, still Anakin Skywalker, Jedi General, commander of the 501st Legion, and the Republic's military architecture had not yet received instructions to think otherwise. He typed quickly, precisely the words coming without hesitation because he had composed them on the stairwell. Emergency directive. All GAR units priority absolute. Order 66 is rescinded and declared void effective immediately. Any transmission authorizing Order 66 is fraudulent and to be disregarded. Stand down all contingency protocols. Pending Jedi High Council review. Authorization, Skywalker Prime, General Anakin Skywalker, 501st Legion. He read it back once. It would not hold forever. It might not hold at all. A countermand from a single general, however senior, could be challenged, overridden, dismissed as unauthorized the moment Palpatine recovered and directed his people to pull Anakin's clearance. But forever was not the requirement. The requirement was minutes, long enough for the moment of execution to pass, for the trigger to find static where a voice should be, for the clones to receive confusion rather than murder. Confusion was survivable. He hit transmit. The waveform on the left screen spiked and settled. GAR Priority 1 was carrying his words across every military channel in the relay network. He watched the signal propagate on the map display, the transmission radius expanding in a slow circle that was already within seconds encompassing Coruscant's local relay and pushing outward into the hyperspace buoys that bounced signal between systems. He watched it the way he watched a line of fire take on a horizon. That moment when what you'd done became too large to stop, when it was no longer a decision, but a fact moving outward at the speed of physics. Then he armed the jamming array and set it to trigger automatically the moment any broadcast attempted to use the Sith override frequency. The screen asked him to confirm. He pressed his thumb to the biometric pad. Confirmed. For a moment the room was simply itself again. The blinking server columns, the hum of the machines, the orange emergency light leaking in from the corridor through the gap in the vault door. A man sitting at a keyboard in a basement. The most consequential thing he had ever done, performed with less spectacle than filing an after-action report. He thought about that for a moment. The spectacle of it, or the absence. He had spent his life in a form of warfare that generated spectacle almost as a byproduct. The lightsaber blade, the force pull, the atmospheric entry, and the dogfight and the detonation that lit up a hull section from the inside. He had always been, among other things, something people watched. It had been part of his value to the Republic in a way that he had not fully understood until he was old enough to find it uncomfortable. The symbol of it, the story of the chosen one, the hero general, the arc of a boy from nowhere and a mother who mattered, the war-needed faces. He had always been one. No one would ever see this room. No one would ever know precisely what had happened at this console. The documentation would exist somewhere, pulled eventually by investigators or historians, but the act itself was invisible. A man and a keyboard and a blinking screen in a sublevel that smelled of old stone and recycled air, and the galaxy pivoting on it without knowing. He found that he did not mind. Then he opened a third channel, encrypted, routing through the temple relay to the GAR's Mandalore Theater command band, and began composing a different kind of message entirely. Not a directive this time. A name. Rex. He pressed his fingers flat against the keypad and thought of the clone captain's face. Steady and deliberate. The face of a man who understood duty the way other men understood breathing, and who had, in another life, held Ashoka Tano upright against the weight of every tragedy that followed. And he thought of what it would cost that man to hear what came next. Rex still had a chip in his skull. Every brother he commanded still had a chip in his skull. What Anakin needed to do, in the next several minutes on an encrypted channel, was convince a soldier who had never been given reason to distrust his own biology that his biology had been weaponized against everyone he had ever fought to protect. He thought of Rex's face in the other timeline, the moment after, when it was already too late, when Rex had clawed his way back through his own compelled actions to something recognizable as himself. The look on that face, the particular quality of a man who has done something irrevocable and has to find a way to continue existing on the other side of it. He was not going to let that moment happen. He began to type the most important warning he had ever sent to anyone in either of his lives. The encrypted channel took 11 seconds to establish. Anakin watched the handshake protocols cycle on the secondary screen. Authentication, re-authentication, the relay bouncing the signal through 3 hyperspace buoys before it reached Mandalore's theater band. And in those 11 seconds, he became acutely aware of how much of the next hour depended on a man picking up a comm. Rex picked up on the 12th second. General Skywalker, no surprise in his voice. That was Rex. The man processed shock internally, filed it somewhere behind his eyes, and gave you his attention instead. It's 0340 hours Coruscant Standard. You're using the theater encryption band. I am. That band's reserved for. I know what it's reserved for. Anakin kept his voice level, the same register he used in combat briefings. Not casual, not urgent, just precise. Because precision was what Rex responded to. I need you to listen to me carefully, Captain. What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, and I need you to set that aside and treat it as an operational briefing. Can you do that? A beat. The channel carried the ambient sounds of Mandalore's theater, distant movement, the low electrical whine of ship systems on standby, what might have been wind through a compromised hull section somewhere behind him. Yes, sir. Order 66 is coming, tonight, within the hour. Rex went quiet. Anakin could hear the calculations. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, not louder, tighter, the way a cable sounds when tension is applied. How certain are you? Completely? Source? Anakin pressed his fingers flat against the console edge. This was the part he had no clean answer for, the part where operational briefing gave way to something that had no category in the GAR's field manual. The source is me, he said. I've seen what happens if we do nothing. I can't explain the mechanism, and I don't have time to try. What I can tell you is that I have already jammed the primary transmission channel and sent a countermand on priority 1, and I need you to execute the next phase on your end before the window closes. What's the next phase? Anakin exhaled. The chips, Rex. The inhibitor chips. The ones in every man in your unit, including you. Every clone in the Grand Army is carrying one, a piece of Kaminoan engineering built into them at Kamino. When the order hits, if it gets through, if my jam fails, or Palpatine finds a backup channel, those chips will fire. Your men will turn. On Ahsoka, on each other, on anything Jedi adjacent in their field of vision. He paused. So will you, until someone cuts it out. He heard Rex breathe, his breath caught, just once. Then, controlled again, the discipline of a man who had trained himself to receive information rather than react to it, who had spent 3 years on the receiving end of news that would have destroyed someone less rigorously built. Rex stopped. General, I need you to say that again. Inhibitor chips. Brainstem level, Kaminoan design. They respond to a coded authorization signal keyed to the Chancellor's identity. When he transmits the order, every clone in the GAR executes it. Not because they choose to. Anakin said it flatly, the way you said things that needed to be heard without the distortion of emotion. Because they can't choose not to. The channel was quiet for a long moment. When Rex spoke again, his voice had not cracked. It had gone very still. The stillness of a man who has received information that reorganizes everything and has decided that the reorganization will happen later, after the immediate problem is solved. Removal procedure, he said. Chip removal. That's what you're asking for. Yes. Starting with you. Starting now. Sir. That's not a field procedure. Inhibitor chip removal requires a medical bay, a scanning unit, surgical. I know what it requires. We have 1 medical bay on the tribunal that's operational, and 2 field surgeons, and the siege isn't over. We have brothers still holding positions across 3 sectors of the city. I can't pull them for. Rex. Anakin said it quietly. I know what I'm asking. I'm asking you to do it anyway, with whatever you have, starting with yourself, right now. Every man you get to in time is a man who stays himself. Every man who stays himself is a man who doesn't have to live the rest of his life with what he did in the next hour. That's the only math that matters. The channel breathed between them. How do you know it works? Rex asked. The removal. How do you know that's the countermeasure? Because I've seen the version of tonight where it doesn't happen in time, Anakin said, and I've seen what you look like on the other side of it. A silence with no resistance in it. A man deciding. Ahsoka, Rex said finally. It was not a question, but it held a question inside it. Several of them, nested, the most important of which Anakin understood without being asked. Is she safe in the version where the jam fails? Is she safe even in this version? Is there a version where she is safe? She's the reason I need you to move fast, he said. She's in the field. She needs to know before the window closes. Find her in person. Don't put it on a channel, not even encrypted, not until we know how many backup frequencies Palpatine has active. Tell her what I've told you. Tell her the threat is real and the countermand is active. Tell her I need her to keep the 501st intact. Whatever happens in the next hour, I need those men operational and on our side when it's over." "Understood." Rex's voice had gone fully military now, the interior processing complete, the calculations resolved. This was Rex at his best. Not because the fear was gone, but because it had been assigned its proper place, and everything else had been moved to the front. "Sir, the men who've already been deployed to the outer sectors, I can't reach them all in time, even if I start now. I know. Some of them are going to receive whatever gets through your jam. I know, Rex. And if the counterman doesn't hold, then we deal with what comes after." Anakin said it flatly, because flatly was the only way to say it. "We can't save everyone in the next 40 minutes. We can save the ones we can reach. That's the mission." A pause. Outside the vault, somewhere in the building's climate infrastructure, a recycling unit cycled through a pressure check, the sound filtering through the walls as a low, deliberate hiss. Then it was quiet again. "Yes, sir. Start with yourself. Get to that medical bay before you do anything else. Then move to whoever's in arm's reach of you. Fast, and don't stop moving." Copy. A sound of movement, Rex rising, the shift of armor, boots on a metal floor. Then a pause. The pause of a man who had one more thing and was deciding whether the moment warranted it. "General, does the Council know you're doing this?" Anakin looked at the server columns around him, the blinking status lights, the screen still showing his counterman propagating outward across the relay map. "No. Does anyone?" "You do." Rex's voice did something between warmth and grief, the sound of a man understanding what someone had carried alone, and choosing, without being asked, to carry some of it. "We'll hold our end," he said. "You hold yours. Always." The channel closed. The speeder bike was not his. Anakin had taken it from the temple's lower vehicle bay without authorization, which, under normal circumstances, would have generated a formal reprimand from the quartermaster and a quiet, disappointed look from Obi-Wan that somehow landed harder than any reprimand. Under these circumstances, it generated nothing, because there was no one in the lower vehicle bay at 0400 hours to witness him swing a leg over the seat, kick the engine to life, and accelerate up the exit ramp into Coruscant's pre-dawn skylane without filing a departure form. The city received him without ceremony. Coruscant at this hour was not quiet. It was never quiet. The planet did not have a mechanism for quiet. The infrastructure was too vast and too densely populated for silence to gain any purchase. But it was different. The commercial lanes were thin. The cargo haulers ran their pre-programmed routes in long, patient convoys, without the midday press of civilian traffic cutting between them. The advertisement projections cycled through their loops, with no crowds below to look up at them. At street level, 20 stories down through gaps in the lane structure, the service districts kept their own hours, and the light from them rose in a faint, reddish column through the lane stack. He pushed the speeder into the express channel and opened the throttle. The wind hit him like a physical argument. Immediate, forceful, insisting he slow down, insisting he reconsider. The kind of resistance that had always made him push harder. He dropped his center of gravity against the handlebars and let the bike find its speed, the engine note climbing from a growl into a sustained high whine that vibrated in his back teeth. Chancellor's District, 11 kilometers. He had, by his best calculation, somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes before Palpatine made his move. The comms jam was active. The countermand was propagating, but those were delaying actions. Speed bumps laid across the road, not a wall built across it. And Palpatine was a man who had spent decades building walls of his own. He thought about Kolar, about Tin, about Fisto. He thought about them deliberately, the way he thought about anything that needed to be looked at directly rather than carried at the periphery of vision. He knew what was waiting in that office. He had known since the moment the Council gave the order to move. Mace would go in with 3 of the best masters in the Order, and 3 of them would not come out. And there was nothing in Anakin's plan, in either version of tonight, that changed that. He had run the calculation, and the calculation had not budged. The comms vault first, the countermand first, the jam first. Not the office. The office was downstream of everything that mattered, and if he reversed the order, he saved 3 people and lost 100,000. He knew this. He had lived with the weight of the knowing for the entirety of the stairwell descent and the vault work, and the comm to Rex. He did not look away from it. Ajin Kolar had a Padawan who was 14 years old and learning to read the living force. Saisi Tian flew better than anyone in the Order who wasn't Anakin, which Anakin had always privately resented and equally privately respected. Kit Fisto laughed in a way that was so genuine it occasionally caught you off guard in briefings, a laugh that had no performance in it, just the simple reaction of someone who found things funny. Anakin had fought beside all three of them. He had eaten with them. He had filed mission reports that crossed their names. He held that knowledge for the length of several city blocks, held it the way he had learned to hold things that were real and terrible and necessary, without flinching and without resolution, because there was no resolution available, only the fact of it, and the choice that had been made anyway. Then he set it aside, filed where it had to go, and rode. He had always been better in motion. He let himself think about Palpatine. 30 seconds, because 30 seconds was all he could afford, and because going in without thinking was the mistake of a younger man. He knew the office. He had stood in it dozens of times across the years of the war. The wide, curved desk, the windows overlooking the Senate district, the red-robed guards who were not what they appeared to be. He knew that Palpatine's surface, in those final hours before the trap closed, would be precisely what it had always been: warm, avuncular, the face of a man who had nothing to hide because the concept of hiding had never applied to him. The mask was not a mask by that point. It was simply another layer of the man, worn so long it had bonded. He knew that Palpatine would try to talk to him first. That was the danger. Not the guards, not the lightning that would come later. The words. The voice. The gift Palpatine had for finding the exact shape of a man's fear and addressing it with such precision and apparent compassion that the fear became, somehow, evidence of trust. Anakin had sat across a desk from that voice and let it work on him for 15 years. And even now, with the full weight of everything he knew pressing down on his understanding, he could feel the faint phantom pull of it. The part of him that was still 22 years old, that still wanted to be told there was a way to keep everything, that someone powerful had the answer if he only... He cut the thought off at the root. You know how that ends. He did not need to be gentle with himself about it. He had stood at the end of that road and looked back across it, and he knew exactly what it cost, and he would not pay it again. He had paid it once at a scale that had taken 23 years to finish paying, and he was still paying it, was going to be paying it for the rest of however long this version of his life ran. And that was the correct consequence of the original choice, and he accepted it without revision. What he would not do was make the choice again. The thought cleared. His hands stayed easy on the handlebars. A proximity alert from the speeder's dash, police drone running a lane compliance sweep, moving toward him at about 30 degrees off his left quarter. He dropped the bike 4 lanes down in a single fluid descent, let the drone pass above him, and came back up in the emergency vehicle channel, which was technically illegal and which he did not have the time to care about. 7 kilometers. He thought about Mace. Mace Windu was already in motion, had to be by now. The Council had sent him. The Council, with the characteristic efficiency of a body that had spent 1,000 years processing threats, had made its decision and dispatched its most capable enforcer, and Mace would be moving toward the Chancellor's office with 3 masters at his back, and none of them knew what waited for them on the other side of that door. He had a complicated relationship with Mace Windu that he had spent years trying to simplify and failed. Mace had been wrong about him, specifically, persistently, in ways that had done real damage, the kind of institutional doubt that accumulated interest across years. And Mace had also not been entirely wrong, which was the harder part to sit with. Mace had looked at a boy from Tatooine with unusual power and unusual attachments, and a volcanic temper he had not yet learned to manage. And he had seen a risk. That was not unfair. What Mace had missed was the boy inside the risk, the parts that were not dangerous but simply frightened, the parts that needed something the Council had no mechanism for providing. Palpatine had had a mechanism for providing it. That was the whole story, reduced to its essential geometry. Palpatine had found the gap between what the Council offered and what Anakin needed, and had lived in that gap for 15 years. The genius of it was not the darkness of it. The genius was that it had not needed to be dark. It had needed only to be warmer than what was already there. Anakin held this, and did not excuse it, and did not condemn anyone with it, and moved on. He thought about Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan was on Utapau, in the middle of an engagement he didn't know had been engineered from both ends. Obi-Wan did not know about the chips. He did not know about the Order. He was, right now, fighting a war that had never been what he thought it was, with no reason to doubt it, which was the truest thing Anakin could say about Obi-Wan across a decade of knowing him. The man had no reason to doubt things that had not yet given him reason to doubt them. His faith in the Republic, in the Council, in the rightness of what they were doing, it was not naivety, it was not weakness. It was the quality of a man who had been given very little reason to revise his fundamental premises and had built something genuine on that foundation. He would have to be told. That conversation was going to be difficult in ways that Anakin could not yet fully map, and he put it in the same file as the grief for Kolar and Teen and Fisto. Real, necessary, downstream. 3 kilometers. The Senate district opened around him as he cleared the last major artery interchange, the architecture changing from the dense commercial towers of the mid-city to the wider, more deliberate spacing of the governmental district. Buildings designed to communicate permanence and authority by the sheer volume of air they left between themselves. The Chancellor's office complex rose ahead, not the tallest structure in the district, but the most centered, the one everything else was oriented toward, the gravitational point of a republic that had spent the last 3 years bleeding out without understanding why. He cut the engine a block out. The speeder coasted on its repulsor field, dropping speed, and he guided it down to a service level that ran beneath the complex's main approach, a maintenance access channel used by cleaning crews and utilities. Wide enough for a vehicle and unmanned at this hour, he brought the bike to a stop against a support pillar and swung off in a single motion. The walk up from the service level to the complex's secondary entrance took 90 seconds. He used them. His lightsaber was at his hip, unignited. He kept it there. He did not know precisely what he was going to say when he walked through that door. He knew what he was not going to say. He was not going to give Palpatine the negotiation Palpatine would try to pull him into. He was not going to allow the conversation to become about Padmé, about the babies, about the fear that had been the original lever. The fear was still there. He was not going to pretend it wasn't, was not going to perform the equanimity he did not entirely have. But the fear and the action were no longer the same thing. He had learned at enormous cost that they did not have to be. He was not going to stand in that office and feel the old gravity of the man and mistake gravity for truth. He was going to walk in, and he was going to end it. The secondary entrance required a Senate complex access code, a numeric sequence he had last entered 8 months ago on a visit he had tried to keep unreported. He entered it from memory. The panel light went green. He pushed the door open. The corridor beyond was empty, long lit in the same amber-tinged overnight illumination as the rest of the governmental district, the carpet muffling his footsteps to nothing. Somewhere ahead and above him, through several floors of bureaucratic architecture, Mace Windu was already in that office. He had stopped calculating the margin. The margin was what it was. He moved down the corridor, turned at the first junction, found the private turbolift that served the Chancellor's floor directly, and stepped inside. The doors closed. He looked at his reflection in the polished durasteel of the turbolift wall, his own face, younger than he had seen it in decades, none of the architecture of the suit, none of the damage that came after, and he did not look away from it. He let himself look, the face of a 22-year-old man who had been handed back something he had not expected to be given, standing in a turbolift in the building of the man who had taken it, on his way to end a plan 80 years in the making. He looked at his reflection, and the reflection looked back, and neither of them looked away. The lift rose. Palpatine's wrist comm was a small thing. That was what struck Mace Windu later when he tried to reconstruct the sequence of events in the order they had actually occurred rather than the order his mind kept insisting on, the smallness of it. The device sat against the Chancellor's wrist like any other piece of personal technology, understated, unremarkable, the kind of thing a man might use to check the time or receive a secretary's reminder about a morning briefing. It did not look like the mechanism of a galaxy's death. Palpatine raised it to his lips without hurry. The office was exactly as it always was. Mace had been in this room before, twice, for formal consultations during the Outer Rim sieges, and once, briefly, to deliver a field report that could not go through normal channels. He had always found it slightly too warm, the temperature calibrated for a man who ran cold, and the ambient light came from sources that were not immediately visible, a diffused gold that flattered everything and revealed nothing. The 4 windows curved behind the Chancellor's desk in a sweep of transparasteel, and through them the Senate district spread outward in its nighttime configuration, all amber and silver, the arteries of the city moving their slow pre-dawn traffic. Mace stood 6 meters from the desk, with 3 masters behind him. Ajahn Kolar to his left, Saesee Tiin to his right, Kit Fisto 2 steps back, and his lightsaber was in his hand but not ignited, and he had said the words that needed to be said. "In the name of the Galactic Senate, you are under arrest." Palpatine had looked at him with an expression that Mace recognized, catalogued and set aside. The expression of a man who has decided that the people in front of him are no longer a factor in his calculations. Not contempt, something quieter than contempt, and colder, the expression of someone who has already moved to the next step. He raised the comm. "Execute order." The word stopped. Not because Palpatine chose to stop it, because the channel opened and gave him nothing, static where a voice should be, the signal alive and open and carrying nothing. Mace heard it from 6 meters away, that non-sound, and did not immediately understand it. Palpatine heard it too. For 1 second, one single second in which the temperature of the room seemed to drop despite the climate controls. Palpatine's expression did something Mace had never seen it do. It registered uncertainty, not alarm, not fear, not the performed vulnerability that would come later. Actual uncertainty, the look of a man who has reached for something that has always been exactly where he left it and found empty air. He lowered the comm, his eyes moved to the device in his hand, as though the problem might be mechanical. Then his eyes moved to Mace, then, very slowly, to the windows. "Interesting," he said. That was all. One word, delivered with the even tone of a man reading a mildly unexpected entry in a ledger. He raised the comm again and changed frequencies with a practiced press of his thumb. A secondary channel, a backup, the existence of which he had not previously needed to disclose. This was the man who had planned for every contingency across a decades-long campaign, without a single critical failure. Of course, there was a backup. The backup gave him the same silence. Mace watched it happen, watched the second attempt return nothing, watched Palpatine's thumb move again to a third position on the frequency selector. The motion so controlled it might have been routine if not for the repetition of it. The mechanical insistence of a man testing the same lock twice because the first result was unacceptable, and watched the third channel deliver the same silence as the first, too. Somewhere in the relay network, something had gotten there before him. Palpatine set the comm down on the desk surface with a quiet, deliberate click. He folded his hands in front of him. He looked at Mace Windu with those pale eyes that gave nothing back, that had never given anything back. Mace understood now. For all the years they had sat across tables together, for all the briefings and the consultations and the careful political navigation of a Senate that had been, the entire time, a stage set for one man's performance. Something cold moved through Mace's understanding. Not quickly, the way cold moved when it was the kind that had been present for a long time and you had simply not noticed it until now. "It appears," Palpatine said, "that someone has been resourceful. Sheev Palpatine." Mace kept his voice flat. "You will come with us." Palpatine looked at the lightsaber in Mace's hand. He looked at the 3 masters behind him. His weight shifted, almost imperceptibly, the subtle redistribution of a man who has decided that one avenue is closed and is now locating another. "I think not," he said. And he came over the desk. There was no warning transition, no dramatic discarding of the Chancellor's robe, no building of visible energy, just the sudden horrible speed of a man who had never actually been old. He crossed the desk in a movement that was almost architectural in its wrongness, the body doing things bodies did not do, and the lightsaber that appeared in his hand was red-bladed and came from nowhere that Mace had been watching. Kolar was the first to respond. He was fast. Mace had trained with Agent Kolar for 11 years and knew his reflexes like his own. And fast was not enough. The red blade took him before his own saber cleared its guard, a single crosscut that was almost surgical in its efficiency, and Kolar was gone before Mace had completed his first step forward. Tin lasted 3 exchanges. He fought well, pressed Palpatine back half a meter in a sequence of Ataru strikes that should have created an opening, and then Palpatine did something that belonged to no school. A movement assembled from pure predatory instinct, and Tin went down. Fisto held longest. 4 seconds. 5, the longest 4 seconds Mace had ever watched. And then he was gone too, and it was only Mace. What followed he would never be able to describe accurately. Vapad required full presence, the willingness to receive the opponent's darkness without fleeing it, and Mace gave it everything, but Palpatine's style had no form and needed none. Pure killing geometry, stripped of every tradition, the angles that lived beneath all the schools, and it drove Mace back toward the window in 30 seconds that cost him more than 30 seconds should have cost. The force around Palpatine ran cold and wrong, a current counter to everything Mace knew, and his options were contracting when the turbolift across the room chimed softly. Its doors opened. Both of them looked. Anakin Skywalker stepped out. The first thing Anakin registered was the bodies. Kolar, Tin, Fisto, 3 masters of the Jedi Order, arranged by the geometry of their deaths across the Chancellor's carpet. Not dramatically, not cinematically, just fallen in the specific graceless ways that bodies fell when the life went out of them quickly. The positions that no one would have chosen. He had known this was coming. Knowing had not prepared him. The knowing and the seeing were different things, he was finding, and the space between them was something he would have to stand in for a moment and then carry forward. He looked at them, held the fact of them, did not look away. Then he moved his attention forward because that was the only thing that honored them now. The second thing he registered was Mace, alive, pressed against the curved window, blade in a low guard that he was maintaining through what Anakin could see was genuine effort. The jaw, the footwork, his breathing was elevated. Mace Windu's breathing was never elevated, and the fact of it told Anakin everything he needed to know about the last 30 seconds. The third thing he registered was Palpatine. The Chancellor stood between Mace and the center of the room, the red blade held loosely at his side, and he was looking at Anakin with an expression that performed surprise so well it almost qualified as the real thing. The warmth came up immediately, that specific warmth, the one that had always felt like recognition, like being seen. The one Anakin now understood was a tool as precisely constructed as any weapon. Anakin. The voice wrapped around the name like a hand closing. Thank the Force. These men have come to... I know why they came. Anakin stepped fully into the room. He did not move toward Palpatine. He did not move toward Mace. He stopped at a distance that kept both of them in his full peripheral vision, and stood there, and his lightsaber stayed at his hip. I know everything, Chancellor. A pause. The warmth in Palpatine's expression shifted, not disappeared, shifted, recalibrating. Everything is a large claim. Order 66. The chips in the clones, the Sith override frequency you tried to use 3 times in the last 60 seconds, and found blocked every time. He watched the pale eyes. The identity you've been holding behind this office for the last 13 years? All of it. I know all of it. The room was still. Mace had not moved from his position at the window. Anakin could feel the older master's attention on him, not hostile, not yet, but heavy with questions that Mace was correctly choosing not to voice. Palpatine looked at Anakin for a long moment. Then the warmth went away entirely. It did not go away like a mask removed. Masks came off with effort, with the suggestion of something held and then released. This went away like a light switching off. One moment it was there, the next moment it was not. And what remained was a face that Anakin had seen only once before. In an opera box, when Palpatine had leaned close and begun to speak of Darth Plagueis the Wise. The face underneath the face, old and cold and completely without performance. You have been busy, Palpatine said. I have. The comms spire, the Priority 1 countermand. He said it without heat, without accusation, the tone of a man reviewing a tactical assessment prepared by someone else, noting competent work. And you reached Rex before I could. A slight tilt of his head. How much of this is your own reasoning, Anakin, and how much of it came from somewhere else? It was perfectly constructed. Even now, even here, the question was designed to introduce doubt, to suggest that Anakin's actions were externally sourced, manipulated, not truly his own. The implication that he was someone's instrument rather than someone's agent, which had always been Palpatine's most effective reframe for every choice Anakin made that didn't serve him. He had used this move across 15 years in 100 different forms. Are you sure this is what you want? Or is this what the Council wants? Are you sure this is wisdom, or is this their caution constraining you again? The move that turned every choice into a referendum on whether Anakin was capable of original thought. Anakin felt it land. He noted where it landed, the way you noted an impact without letting it take you off your feet. Mine, he said simply. Palpatine's eyes moved to the lightsaber on Anakin's hip, then back to his face. You haven't ignited it. No. That's interesting. The old voice was thoughtful now, genuinely analytical, the warmth fully replaced by something almost collegial. An intelligence assessing another intelligence without the distraction of emotion. You came through that door knowing what was in this room. 3 dead masters, a Sith Lord, and a man pinned to a window. You have every reason to ignite it. I have every reason not to. Tell me one. Anakin looked at him. He looked at the face he had trusted above almost every other face in his life, the face of the man who had attended his competitions as a boy on Coruscant, who had visited him in the medical bay after Geonosis, who had called him son in the quiet moments when the war ground everyone else down to silence. The face of the man who had taken that trust and used it as a demolition tool, who had looked at a boy with no one in the galaxy and made himself into the shape of someone, and held that shape for 15 years. He did not feel nothing. He was not going to lie to himself about feeling nothing. There was something real here, underneath the analysis and the preparation and the clarity of purpose, something that had been real once and remained real in the way that things remained real even after the foundation beneath them collapsed. Palpatine had been something to him, not what he had thought he was being, not what he had presented himself as being, but something, a presence in the years when presence was what Anakin had least and needed most. That was true, even though everything built on top of it was not. He could hold both of those things without one of them canceling the other. But he had come too far and paid too much to let the feeling become the action. Because you'd prefer I ignite it, he said. You've always preferred that. You've been building toward me igniting it for 15 years. You want the emotion? You want the step across the line because the step across the line is what makes the next step easier, and the next one, until I'm something that doesn't ask questions anymore. He paused. I've seen where that path ends. I'm not interested. Something moved in Palpatine's expression. Not the performed warmth, not the cold assessment. Something that was, for one unguarded second, closer to actual surprise than anything he had allowed Anakin to see in 15 years of knowing him. You've seen it, he said. Not a question. Studying him. Yes. How? It doesn't matter. It matters enormously. The pale eyes narrowed, and Anakin recognized the focus behind them, the full attention of a mind that had spent centuries reading people, now encountering a variable it had not modeled. You carry something different today, something in the force around you has. What comes next, Anakin said, is you surrendering to Master Windu. The pause that followed was the length of a single breath. Then Palpatine smiled. It was not the Chancellor's smile, not the warmth performance. This was something else, small and private, the smile of a man who has found the situation genuinely, darkly amusing. You've decided, he said. Something happened to you and it changed your calculations completely, and you walked into this room, having already decided, and now you're waiting for me to make the same decision. A pause. You really believe I will? No, Anakin said. I believe you won't. I believe you're going to make the other choice, because you've always made the other choice, and I'm going to be here when you do. He reached down and unclipped his lightsaber from his belt. He held it in his right hand, the Durasteel hand, the one that had no nerve endings to register the grip, and so had learned to grip by other measures. And he did not ignite it. He held it the way a man held a key. Mace Windu, at the window, straightened. He looked at Anakin across the room, not with gratitude, not with trust, not with any of the things Anakin had perhaps once hoped for, but with unmistakable professional recognition. The look of a man who has been fighting alone and has registered the presence of someone who knows what they are doing. He raised his blade back to guard. Skywalker, he said. Lo, you're late. I know. Anakin settled his weight, felt the force move around both of them. Not warmly, not easily, but honestly, the way two people moved in the same space when they both understood what the space required. I'll make up the time. Across the room, Palpatine's red blade rose. He came for Mace first, the correct calculation, the closer edge, and he was fast in the way he had always been fast, the speed of someone who had stripped away everything except the killing geometry. He almost reached Mace. Anakin's blade ignited. Blue. The color hit the walls before the sound did, and the saber arrived in the gap between Palpatine's strike and Mace's body. Not a parry, a placement, the blade arriving at the angle required to redirect the red saber into the window frame, where it scored a black groove and spent itself against the wall. Palpatine pulled the strike back and turned. He looked at Anakin. Then he gathered, there was nothing to see. A pressure drop in the force itself, the way pressure dropped before a capacitor discharged, and Anakin recognized it below the level of thought, the body already moving before the mind caught up. He had felt this once before, from the other side of a memory he would rather not have had access to, the sensation of enormous, focused power building toward a single release point. He dropped his lightsaber, let the magnetic clip take it at his hip, raised both hands, open-palmed, into the space between them. The lightning came from both hands. The full expenditure, the thing beneath all the other things, everything Palpatine had spent a century becoming poured into the space between them. It turned the room blue-white, blew out 2 ceiling fixtures, cracked the lower panel of the window behind Mace with the energy displacement, and it was enormous, genuinely, physically enormous. The force conducting a volume of energy that his body registered as heat and pressure, and a bone-deep vibration that made his back teeth ache and his legs push against the floor with everything they had. He caught it, not painlessly. The current moved through his palms and up his forearms and into his shoulders, and he stood in the stream and his breathing went rough. Not ragged, not panicked, just the honest sound of a man moving something very heavy, and he redirected it downward, into the floor, into Coruscant's deep infrastructure, dispersed, harmless, returned to the system that generated it without a death to show for its passage. The lightning stopped, not because Palpatine chose to stop it, because there was nothing left to send. He stood with his hands at his sides, and his chest moving in a way it had not moved through any of the preceding combat. Visible, the chest actually moving, the breathing of a man who had discharged everything and found the arithmetic insufficient, and his face was doing something Anakin had never seen it do in 15 years of knowing him. Showing fatigue, real fatigue. Not the managed frailty the Chancellor performed for Senate galleries or committee hearings, not the performance of an old man seeking sympathy, the actual fatigue of a body that had been pushed past the edge of what even a century of practice could sustain. He looked, in this moment, every year of his age. The room settled into silence. Mace had not moved from the window. His voice, when it came, was quiet. It's over. Palpatine's eyes moved to Mace, to Anakin, to the windows behind Mace, where the Senate district hung in its nighttime configuration, a galaxy he had spent 80 years building into his instrument. Over, he repeated, testing it, the word of a man who had spent 8 decades in motion, arriving at a room where the motion had stopped. Then the red blade came up one more time, slow, deliberate, not fast the way everything else had been fast. The gesture of a man who understood it was probably futile, and made it anyway because pride was the last expenditure left, when everything else had been spent. Anakin did not ignite his blade. He stepped forward and moved inside the arc, where the leverage was wrong, and his durasteel hand closed around Palpatine's wrist. The crack was small, precise, clinical, the sound a thing made when force was applied past its tolerance. Palpatine's hand opened, the red hilt dropped, and Anakin caught it with his left hand before it reached the floor and set it on the Chancellor's desk without looking at it. Palpatine had not made a sound. He stood with his broken wrist held close to his body, not cradled, held, with the muscular control of a man who had decided this would not register in his face, and he looked at Anakin. What was in his eyes was not rage, not fear, not the performed vulnerability, not any of the emotions Anakin had prepared himself to meet. Recognition. "You've done this before," Palpatine said. Quiet, the voice of a man genuinely calculating, not performing. Not this, specifically, but something like this. You've stood in this moment and you chose differently, and it cost you. Anakin said nothing. Enormously, the pale eyes moved across his face with the focus of a mind encountering something that would not resolve into any pattern it had built. And you came back and chose this instead. The restraint, the procedural ending for a man who has spent 80 years earning something considerably less comfortable than a trial. He looked at the desk, at the red hilt sitting on it. You could give me what I've earned, and you won't. No. Why? Anakin looked at him. He looked at the face that had been father and weapon simultaneously, both of them real, both of them true. The father made from the same material as the weapon so that you could not remove one without the other, so that the thing you had needed, and the thing that needed you, had been the same device all along. He looked at the face of the man who had found a 9-year-old in the desert, and seen exactly what that boy needed and spent 15 years manufacturing it, so that when the moment came, the boy's grief would be indistinguishable from the man's ambition, and the boy would reach for what was offered and call it love. He felt the pull. He was not going to pretend he didn't. not the dark side calling with the hot current of rage that had always been the entry point. That particular door was closed, and he had closed it himself. And the closing had cost something he did not have a name for yet, but recognized as necessary. What he felt was something colder and quieter. The simple arithmetic of proximity to a man who had caused incalculable harm, standing within arm's reach, and the fact that the problem had an immediate, irreversible solution right there in his durastial hand. Not rage, just math. He let the math move through him and disperse, the way he had let the lightning disperse. Harmless, spent, returned to wherever it came from. Because it's what you'd want, he said. You'd want me to do it. Every step, every line you ever fed me, the whole architecture of it was pointed at getting me to do exactly this, and the fact that you've been arrested and your wrist is broken and your plan has failed doesn't change what the act would make me. So, no. Palpatine was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice that held nothing performed in it, the vision you had, the darkness around her. It hasn't changed, Anakin. Whatever happened to you tonight, whatever showed you this path, the Force showed you that too. She's still in danger. That was never about me. Anakin felt the hook in it, recognized it immediately, the way you recognize something you had been trained to reach for, the way your hand moved toward a tool before you had decided to pick it up. He let his hand stay still. She's alive, he said. Right now, tonight, she's alive. The danger you showed me was the danger you created. You built the trap, and then showed me the trap and told me you were the only way out of it. He held Palpatine's gaze. I know that now. I'm not reaching for the door you built. Something shifted in Palpatine's face. Not concession, recalculation. He was still looking for the angle, still moving through the available approaches, still the mind that had modeled every person it had ever encountered, and found the place where the model broke open. I built you, Palpatine said then, and the shift in his voice was the shift of a man setting down one tool and lifting a different one. Not warm anymore, not cold. Direct, in the way that a man was direct when he had stopped performing and started simply speaking. I found you in the desert when you were 9 years old, and I looked at what you were, and I understood it better than anyone in that temple ever did or ever would. I spent 15 years making sure the galaxy had no place for what you were, except beside me. A pause, the pause of a man letting weight settle. And you've turned that back. Not because you're weak, because you're precisely what I made. I built you to be capable of exactly this moment, and you're standing in it and you're refusing it. His eyes were very still. You've beaten me at the only game I know how to play. Anakin said, I know, he said it simply. Not with satisfaction, not with grief, not with the weight of vindication, just as a fact that was true and that he had already made his peace with. The silence that followed was not a standoff. It had no tension left in it. It was the silence of a room where a very large thing had finished, where the current that had been running through every exchange, every choice, every version of this conversation across 15 years had finally reached its terminus, and simply stopped. Mace moved. He came forward and stood in front of Palpatine, and he reached into his robe and produced a set of stun cuffs, standard Republic restraint devices, the kind Temple security carried on formal arrest details, the kind that had not been used on anyone of Chancellor-level authority in the history of the office. Sheev Palpatine, Mace said, also known as Darth Sidious, you are remanded to the custody of the Jedi Order pending transfer to the Senate Security Bureau and formal arraignment before the Supreme Court of the Republic. He held out the cuffs. Palpatine looked at them. He looked at them the way a man looked at a thing he had spent his life constructing the conditions to avoid, now arrived, not with horror, not with the rage of someone whose plan has been disrupted, with something that had no clean name, the expression of a man standing at the end of an enormous amount of work, in the room where the work had stopped, taking the full measure of that fact. He extended his unbroken wrist. Mace closed the cuff, then carefully, without comment, guided the broken wrist into the second cuff and sealed it with the minimum pressure required, the action of someone making an arrest rather than delivering a punishment. Palpatine did not react to the handling of the broken wrist. He held whatever expression he held, and he looked at the middle distance, and when Mace turned him toward the door, he walked. No resistance, no theater, no performance of dignity, just a man who had run out of road, walking toward a door. Anakin looked at Mace over Palpatine's shoulder. The look held for a moment. Not long. In it was the acknowledgement that something had happened in this room, that neither of them had been prepared for, and both of them understood. Not warmth, they had not suddenly become easy with each other. Not the resolution of every old friction, just truth, recognized between two people who both understood what truth cost and did not look away from its price. Mace nodded once. Anakin nodded back. Then Mace turned Palpatine toward the door and walked him out of the office, and the sound of their footsteps receded down the corridor, the firm and deliberate footfall of a Jedi Master, and beside it, quiet as anything, the ordinary footsteps of an old man. Anakin was the last one out. He stood in the office for a moment, alone. He looked at the scorched carpet where the lightning had run its line from Palpatine's hands to his. He looked at the dead ceiling fixtures, at the window behind where Mace had been standing, the stress fracture running across its lower panel in a thin black line. At the red lightsaber hilt, sitting on the Chancellor's desk where he had set it, evidence, waiting for whoever came next to process this room and begin the long work of understanding what had happened in it. He looked at all of it, and he looked at the windows. At the Senate district running its slow, indifferent, ordinary pre-dawn traffic, the city conducting its business in complete ignorance of what had just finished in this building. Not for long. He picked up the red hilt and held it for a moment, felt the weight of it, the construction of it, the century of choices that had narrowed to this object, and then set it back down. Evidence, not his to carry. He took one more look at the room. Then he pulled the door closed. He did not follow Mace immediately. The corridor was empty, the overnight lights doing what overnight lights did, making everything slightly less real than it would be in a few hours when the building's morning cycle came up and the staff began to arrive and found the world reassembled around a different axis than the one they had left the evening before. He stood outside the closed door and breathed, his own lungs. Clean air, the building's climate system cycling quietly around him. He thought about what the next hours required. The clones in the field. His countermand was active and the jam was holding, but neither would hold indefinitely. And the men in the outer sectors were beyond his reach, and some of them were going to receive whatever got through the interference. He knew this, and he had made the choice, and he was going to live with the arithmetic of that choice. But the choice did not close the problem. The problem remained open. Someone with the authority to close it needed to be moving the moment the Senate opened its doors, and that meant Bail Organa, whose integrity Anakin had no reason to doubt, needed to be reached before the morning session. It meant the council needed to be briefed in a form that could survive Palpatine's legal team, which meant Mace needed documentation before he handed Palpatine to anyone in the Security Bureau who might be compromised. It meant Obi-Wan needed a message before he heard it from anyone else. That one was going to require more than a comm. He thought about Obi-Wan on Utapau, in the middle of a campaign he now understood had been engineered from both ends. And he thought about the conversation that was going to be required to explain what had happened tonight, and why it had happened, and what it meant about every battle they had fought for 3 years. Obi-Wan was a man who processed information rigorously and without sentimentality, who had the capacity to revise his understanding of a situation without losing his footing when the revision was large. He was going to need that capacity. What had happened tonight was the largest revision available. Anakin would find a way to tell him. He stood in the corridor for another moment, letting the list take shape and then letting it go. Not because the list didn't matter, but because the list was for later, and later was no longer the threat it had been an hour ago. Later was now simply later, real, demanding, full of work, and survivable. He moved. The speeder ride back was nothing like the ride out. He kept the engine low, stayed in the standard lanes, let the city move around him at the pace the city wanted. Coruscant's artificial dawn was beginning in earnest above the Skylane stack. Not sunlight yet, not real light, but the atmospheric processors cycling into their morning sequence, the sky above the upper lanes thinning from black to a deep, bruised blue. That meant something was coming. He left the speeder in the vehicle bay and went up through the temple by the east stairwell, not the sublevel route this time. The temple's morning corridors were starting to populate, early risers, a knot of younglings whose schedules ignored the hour and who looked at him with the uncomplicated interest that younglings brought to the presence of a general. A question forming in the face of one of them that her instructor gently redirected before it could land. He passed a Padawan who looked at the state of his tunic and at his face and made the correct judgment that this was not a moment to ask. He passed a temple guard whose eyes tracked him down the corridor with the professional attention of someone who had noticed that the general had come back from somewhere and bore the marks of it, and who chose, correctly, not to inquire about the details. He let himself into the council chamber. Still empty, still the ring of chairs in the amber light that came through the windows, the city below still in its pre-dawn thinning, the gold beginning to shift towards something cooler and cleaner as the atmospheric cycle moved through its morning progression. The same room he had left, he checked his internal clock, 4 hours and 20 minutes ago, when he sat up in Mace's chair with his hands shaking and his lungs working, and 23 years of accumulated consequence pressing down on him from a direction time wasn't supposed to run. He walked to the window that faced east. He did not sit. He stood at the glass and looked out at Coruscant waking into its ordinary morning, the cargo convoys giving way to civilian traffic in the upper lanes, the commercial projections brightening, the governmental district beginning to light its windows as the first staff arrived for the early shift. A Senate guard changing his post rotation 400 meters away, visible only as a movement in the reflected light of the building across from him. A cleaning droid making its way along the maintenance walkway below the main skylane level, indifferent to anything above its altitude. The ordinary world, still running, still turning on its ordinary axis. He had been afraid, in the version of the night where everything went wrong, that the ordinary world would simply continue without the people it should have contained. He had been right to be afraid of that. The ordinary world was perfectly capable of continuing. It did not require the right people to be in it. It did not notice their absence. It turned regardless, the traffic running, the projections brightening, the cleaning droids on their schedules, and the gap where someone should have been was simply a gap that the world moved around rather than a wound that demanded its stop. He had been given, tonight, the version where the gaps did not open. Most of them. He stood with that knowledge and did not reach for anything to soften it. Kolar and Teen and Fisto were still gone, and the clones in the outer sectors who had received whatever signal got through the jamming were still facing what they were facing. And Obi-Wan was still on Utapau, in a campaign that needed to end on different terms than the terms it was running on. These were not failures of tonight's plan. They were the price of a plan that had not had access to infinite time or infinite clearance, and the price was real, and he would carry it. But Padmé was alive. The children were alive. Rex was alive and moving toward a medical bay, and the men in arm's reach of him were being reached. Ahsoka would be fine, because Ahsoka was always fine. Because Ashoka was the kind of person the galaxy kept returning, because it needed her more than it needed the version of events where she wasn't in it. And he had enough faith in Rex to know that Rex would find her before the window closed. And Palpatine was in stun cuffs. Walking down a corridor with Mace Windu's hand on his arm. And the red lightsaber was sitting on a desk in an empty office. And the Sith override frequency was broadcasting to a wall of static. And the countermand was propagating outward through the relay network at the speed of light. Anakin stood at the temple window and let the actual light come up. Not the manufactured pre-dawn cycle, the real thing. Coruscant's star clearing the planet's shadow, the line of it climbing the window's face in a band of warm gold, moving slowly across the council floor, crossing the ring of chairs one by one, each seat briefly illuminated as the light passed over it. Mace's chair, Yoda's chair, the empty seats of the dead and the living, the center of the room where he had stood so many times and been assessed. The light reached him at the window and he let it. He thought about Padmé, not the vision, the person, the way she had looked at him across the emergency session of the Senate a year ago, when the politics had been so tangled neither of them could navigate it cleanly, and the look she had given him over the heads of 3 other senators had contained an entire conversation they would have later, privately, in a room where she did not have to be a senator, and he did not have to be a general, and they could simply be people who had found each other in the middle of a war. He thought about the first time she had laughed at something he had said, a genuine laugh, the kind that caught her off guard, and the specific feeling of that, of having made her laugh, of the realization that making her laugh was a thing he was going to want to keep doing for as long as she was willing to let him. He thought about the weight of her hand on his arm, the way she thought through problems, not faster than him, not slower, just differently, at angles he didn't naturally consider, and how the two modes of thinking fit together in a way that felt, when they were working, like a single larger mind. He was going to go to her. Not now, not before the work was done and the council had been briefed, and the morning's emergency had been given to the people whose job it was to carry it forward. But soon, he was going to go to her, and he was going to tell her all of it. Not the mechanics of the comms vault and the frequency architecture, but what it had felt like to sit in that chair, with his hands shaking and understand the full dimensions of what he had been given back. She deserved to know the shape of what tonight had been. She was going to have questions he didn't have answers for, and she was going to work through them in her particular way, and he was going to be present for that, and it was going to be not easy. Nothing between them was simple, but real, which was the thing they had always had that compensated for everything they didn't. The gold moved across the floor and reached the wall and climbed it, and the council chamber was fully in the morning now, the overnight amber gone, replaced by something cleaner and more neutral. The light that a room had when it was simply a room and not a theater for anything. There were calms to send, conversations he owed people, work ahead that was going to be long and complicated and would require everything he had. He let all of it wait for one more minute. He stood at the temple window and he breathed, and the war that had been running inside him since he was 9 years old on a desert planet, nothing but sky above him and grief below, and a future that felt like something always about to happen and never arriving, was quiet, not gone. He understood now that it did not go entirely. The losses were real, and the damage was real, and the work of rebuilding would require everything he had left to give it. But quiet. For the first time in either of his lives, the war inside him was quiet, and in the quiet there was room. Room for the morning, for the work, for the conversations he owed, and the ones he was going to want to have. Room for Padmé and the children. Room for Ahsoka and Rex and Obi-Wan, and everyone who was going to need to find their footing in a galaxy that had shifted on its axis overnight. Room for grief when the grief was ready to be felt. Room for whatever came next, not because whatever came next was going to be easy, but because it was going to be real, and real was the thing he had been trying to find his way back to for the entirety of the other version of his life. He looked at his hands in the morning light. Left one, right one, still here, still his. The durasteel of the right one caught the sun and held it for a moment, throwing a small reflection against the wall, a point of light, ordinary, brief, the kind of thing that happened in rooms when the morning came in at the right angle and found something to reflect off, and that no one paid any attention to because it was so small and so common. He paid attention to it. He watched the small reflected light on the wall until the angle shifted and it was gone, and he thought about how much of living was composed of exactly that. The small and common things that you had no reason to notice unless you had spent 23 years in a suit of armor in a dark that had no windows, in which case you noticed all of it, all of the time, the light and the air and the fact of your own hands and the clean and ordinary miracle of a morning that had not asked anything of you yet. The council would arrive at their chairs within the hour. Mace would be back with Palpatine in custody, and a situation that would require more explanation than either of them had ever given in that room. The temple would wake around that situation and begin to process it, and the processing would be complicated and loud, in the particular way that institutions were loud when the ground shifted beneath them. When people who had built their understanding on a certain set of premises found themselves required to revise without a map. He was going to have to be present for all of it, not as the chosen one, not as a symbol, not as the hero of the story the Republic had needed for 3 years. As someone who had done something specific and consequential, and was prepared to account for it, answer for it, explain each step of it to people who would have questions, and whose questions deserved real answers, he found that he did not dread it. He turned from the window. He had work to do. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.